Okay, hi. So today we're going to talk about all the nonfiction that I read this year. My goal is to get this up before the end of Nonfiction November. Unfortunately, I didn't totally participate this year. November happened, things happened at the beginning of November in the US, and the type of nonfiction that I normally read, I just wasn't really mentally prepared for. So I am reading a little bit, but I wanted to chat through all the nonfiction that I did read this year and kind of wrap it all up. Okay, so the first one that I read is Atomic Habits. This is a little bit more of what I would consider a self-help book. I guess I'll give the self-help disclaimer of this is only going to be accessible for those whose life it can be accessible for. So this one is about habit building. So he kind of just walks through ways of building habits, and he'll give statistics and studies and stuff along the way. This is one of those books that I don't feel like you need to actually read the book to gain the values out of the book. If you were able to find a summary of each chapter with the main bullet points of the types of ways you could build habits, you could just read that and get the same out of the book as what I got out of the book reading the whole thing. I read this in January and it is now November. So there are certain things that I think about from this book, some of the points he made around building habits around other habits that while I won't say I've completely implemented into my life, and I wouldn't say this was groundbreaking changes into how I exist from day to day, I think that he does give interesting ideas and tidbits about how to manage habit creation in a way that isn't daunting. Okay, so the next one is The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. This one is pretty dense and has a lot of information in it. The introduction explains exactly what the book is intending to accomplish. The authors originally published this as a article, and then they expanded it into a full book and then published this in 2007. Given the current situation in Israel, I think it is interesting to read where they kind of left off this nonfiction in 2007, and knowing that we've come 15 years later and it's headed in the same direction that the text kind of outlines. So it kind of goes through the U.S.'s relationship with Israel and kind of the political propaganda around the relationship, the actual monetary incentives that the United States gives to Israel and how those have changed over time, and kind of argues the case that it actually is not in the U.S.'s best interest to have this relationship with Israel that has been created and continues to move forward in the current time that they were writing this book. That is still very consistent today. So overall, I thought it was a really interesting book, had a lot of really interesting facts. I thought it was put together really well, had a good structure, and overall I would highly recommend it to anyone who has interest in understanding the United States' relationship to Israel. Okay, moving on to a totally different topic. I'm going in chronological order of when I read them. So this is The Once and Future Sex: Going Medieval on Women's Roles in Society. So it's basically about women in the Middle Ages, gender, sex, relationships, and role within society itself. It acknowledges that there's not a lot of direct information, mainly because there's not a lot of firsthand narrative or firsthand experience that comes from the Middle Ages written by women. So a lot of it is relying on texts and literature and notes and letters and stuff like that from men and men's perspective on women, although there were some firsthand female perspectives that were incorporated into the text. So it takes how the Roman Empire and classic times kind of influenced what became the medieval time, Middle Ages, and then the influence of the Middle Ages going into the Enlightenment. And the last chapter kind of connects it back to modern times. So it's a pretty short read. I think that there's a lot of idea about the notion that progress is linear. But then if you read something like this, you can clearly identify that progress is not linear, because if it were, we would be much farther into the realm of equality than we currently are. So overall, a short read and an interesting read if that fascinates you. Okay, the next one is The Big Fat Surprise: Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet. So this one is not written by a health professional. It's written by a journalist who starts exploring the idea of nutrition and nutritional science. And a lot of this book is breaking down the studies that have built up to the modern concept of nutrition and showing the weaknesses of those studies. They were all performed on men. They were performed on men with certain health conditions. Like, certain data was removed when it was published. The type of data that they were getting was unreliable. How it's very challenging to have studies generally, even now, on nutrition and trying to maintain someone eating the same thing every day. It's really hard to control for that type of thing. The kind of loud voices of nutritional science from the historical context, and how those voices were the ones that got heard, even if they weren't necessarily correct, and then kind of the movement of that into the politicalization of nutrition. And this is mainly, some of the studies are across the world, but it's mainly the politicalization of nutrition within the United States. So, if you were going to school in the 90s and 2000s, like I was, it was the Triangle of Foods. That was a political initiative that was backed by very specific people in the nutritional science food who didn't all align, and kind of how these specific scientists would bully people out of the nutritional science realm. So it was kind of talking about the actual science, or the studies and the lacks in the studies, and the humans involved, and then the things that are unknown. So I found this book really fascinating. It definitely kind of opened my mind to why is it that we say that certain fats are healthy and certain fats aren't healthy? How much data and science is behind those concepts? There was this one part where it talked about specific types of HDL cholesterol, I think, and how there's really two types of HDL cholesterol, but how we identify it, we only identify it as one big unit, and there could be good and bad within that. So overall, I thought the book was really interesting. There's dissenting opinions from people within the science field, or I should say in the health field. I see dissenting opinions from doctors and nurses. But I didn't, when I was looking into the book, I didn't see dissenting opinions from people who are actually in the nutritional science field, which I would have been more interested in getting into a little bit more, because those are the people that are actually performing the studies and stuff. So anyway, overall, I thought it was a really interesting book. I feel like it would pair really well with The Case Against Sugar, I think. I'll put it on screen. I read it a few years ago, and they kind of they feel like they should be read in context together. Okay, so the next one is Pests: How Humans Create Animal Villains. So this book is about how we define as humans different animals as pests, based on our relationship with them. And so each chapter for the most part, is about a different animal and our relationship with that animal from like maybe a historic position and from a modern position, and like how over time that animal is determined to be a nuisance. So overall, it didn't go very deep with anything. It was kind of a light read. And I didn't dislike it, but I do think that there was some nuance from my perspective that was missing in the text, specifically around the concept of a pest versus an invasive species. She kind of brings up invasive species as a lens of which to see something as a pest, but she seems to conflate invasive with non-native, which is not necessarily the same thing. You can have a species that is non-native that isn't pushing out native species, and if it's not doing that, generally speaking, it's not considered invasive. So I think that there was just like a little bit more sciencing that the author could have done, and that could have been incorporated into the text to make it a little bit less of like a narrative and a little bit more of like a science nonfiction. I'll get to a book I'm currently reading that I think does that really well at the end. I also think that one of the negatives that I saw in this text is that she talks about a lot of conjecture and unproven hypothesis, which I think is fine, but you have to be like a little bit more clear and intentioned when you are conveying that type of information. Okay, moving on to the next one. Dark Archives, a librarian's investigation into the science and history of books bound in human skin. This one is very niche. The author is a person who has become fascinated herself with the topic. She's a librarian and she worked in science libraries. So this comes up more in science libraries because it seems that the people that are more likely to bind a book in human skin are doctors from the past who have access to human skin. This book touches on like the morals and ethics of doing that, and that's like a lot of what the book itself is chatting through, because people have very differing opinions on that. I found that part less interesting in some contexts because I personally think that if someone consents to their skin being used to bind something, then that's like not that big of a deal. But as you read this, you will learn that that's in fact probably not what's happening. This kind of talked about the racialized aspects of the past of this, the lack of consent that may have been gained, the kind of the disproving of some books being ones made of human skin. So like she is actually like on a team of people that will test these books, and some got proven to be made of like horse or lamb or something like that, and some of them did end up being proven to be human skin. And then with those ones going down like the rabbit hole of like how did that come to be? So overall, I really liked this one. Super niche topic, but I was all about reading it, and very short. So if you want to learn more about books bound in human skin, this is the book for you. Okay, and then I read another book about sex because I guess why not? This one is much more sex focused and not gender and gender role focused, though that does come into play. This is called A Curious History of Sex. And the author goes through this in the introduction, but is basically like, I wanted to write a book about the history of sex, and I wanted to pick things that were interesting to me. So there's a lot of things left out of this book, and that's okay. So some of the topics included words used to convey sex, the actual sex organs, toys, food and sex, hygiene and sex, reproduction, and money and sex. Overall, I thought the book was interesting. I think that because she broached it from the idea of like facets of sex history that she was interested in pursuing, the chapters were very focused. She also incorporated just like a lot of like words that were used to describe sexual things throughout it, and then would mark like their origin or when they were most used, something like that. And yeah, it was overall a really fun read, so I would also recommend this one. Okay, and then the last one I finished, but then I'll talk about the ones I'm currently reading. This is the third Gilmore. So this is written by Kelly Bishop, who is the Emily Gilmore in the Gilmore Girls. I think that with a majority of celebrity memoirs, you kind of have to be interested in the person to want to read the book. So I've watched Gilmore Girls. I've read Lauren Graham, who played Lorelai's memoir. So I was like, I'll read this too and see how it goes. She talks a lot about all of the roles that she had coming into being Emily Gilmore. She talks about a lot of her experience being on Broadway and living in New York City in the 50s. She talks about being there for the AIDS epidemic and being in the art realm, in the theater realm, and like knowing a lot of people that are impacted by that, though she doesn't go into a ton of detail. She talks about her family life growing up and her relationship with her parents. And then she also chats through like her marriages. I think she was married twice. And her relationship with her husband, her second husband, who she was married to for many. And then of course she also talks about Gilmore Girls. Like normal celebrity memoirs, fairly superficial, isn't going super deep into things. I listened to it. She narrated it, so that's always like better for me for celebrity memoirs, because then you get into their cadence and flow. But those are all the ones that I finished in 2024. And now I'll talk about the books that I'm currently reading. So I'm currently reading Making of a Manager. This is a book I wanted to read like 3 years ago when I actually became a manager and never did, and I'm slowly kind of making my way through it. I think even as a person who has managed for, 3 years, it's helpful in some capacity in how to manage. I think that there's a lot of things that she talks about that are not relatable if you work in like a very corporate job. She worked in startups, so it's stuff like, oh, well, if someone's not working on your team, just fire them. And that's like, I don't know about everyone else, but you can't just fire someone unless they're doing something really heinous where I work. So stuff like that, that's not totally relatable to, I think, every particular job. And then I'm working towards managing people who would manage other people. So I think that's giving me a fresh perspective on like what they're experiencing as becoming a new manager. The next book I'm reading is Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. This is the one that I said I wanted to come back to, because I think this is a good example of a journalist who is writing more narrative style, writing themselves into the narrative of what they're talking about in different challenges with roads and ecology and wildlife and all of that, habitat fragmentation, noise pollution, health conditions that it might cause to different types of animals, the types of animals you see versus the types of animals you don't see, the number of roads in the national forests in the United States. But he does it in such a way where he's combining a lot of interesting conversations with scientists and actual studies of these things into his writing. So it feels a little bit more sciencey, like he kind of dove in a little bit deeper, and I think that he's an environmental journalist, so he probably has some sort of background in the sciences. But I'm not done with it yet. I'm a little over halfway through, and overall really enjoying it so far. And then I'm currently reading a book that came out in November. I'm only a chapter in, so I've really only read the introduction, and it's Don't Build, Rebuild: The Case for Imaginative Reuse in Architecture. I'm going to be really interested to see where this actually goes, because the idea of rebuilding instead of building new is known to have much less environmental impact. But the concept of building an economy around reuse at that scale sounds very challenging without incentives in place. So I'm interested to see where he's going to go with it and if he's going to have examples of that specifically and where it's worked in the world. So that's all I have for this video. Those are all the nonfiction that I have read or am currently reading and probably will get to in 2024. But let me know your thoughts on any of these books. So until next time, happy reading.